Nolan Aberhart was 41 years old, and the only thing in his life that had never broken down on him was his daughter. Everything else, the marriage, the savings account, the job title he'd held for 6 years before the company restructured and handed his department to someone 15 years younger with a business degree and soft hands. All of it had failed him in one way or another. But Maisie, 7 years old and missing her 2 front teeth, still believed her father could fix anything. She said it the way children say things, without hesitation, without needing proof. And that belief, thin and uncomplicated as it was, had kept Nolan functional through the year after Carla died, through the winter that followed, through the kind of quiet that moves into a house after a person leaves it forever. He'd taken the contract work because he needed the income and because standing still felt dangerous. Aberhart Mechanical, which was just Nolan, a truck, and a reputation built over 18 years of showing up on time, had kept them afloat. Apartment buildings, industrial units, the occasional private residence. He fixed what was broken and he charged what was fair, and he did not complain. Because complaining was something he'd stopped doing around the time he realized it changed nothing. The call came on a Tuesday morning in February, when the temperature in Winnipeg had dropped to -28, and the sky had that white quality it gets when the cold stops being weather and starts being the whole world. The company was called Nolan Voss Infrastructure Partners. The contact was a facilities coordinator named Brett, who spoke quickly and used the word escalated 3 times in under a minute. The primary boiler in their downtown office building had failed overnight. Their usual contractor was unavailable. Nolan was third on their call list. "Can you be there by 8:30? Brett asked. Nolan was already backing out of the driveway. "I'll be there by 8. The building was a 15-story tower on portage, glass-fronted and newer than it looked. The lobby had that particular chill of a space that had been warm and was now losing its warmth by degrees. You could feel it before you saw anyone's breath. The security guard at the desk was wearing his coat. The receptionist had a space heater under her desk that she hadn't turned on because the sign on the wall said no personal heating devices, and she was the kind of person who followed signs even when they were punishing her. Nolan signed in, clipped the visitor badge to his jacket, and took the elevator to the mechanical room in the basement. He'd worked in enough buildings to know that the story of what had gone wrong was usually written on the equipment itself, if you knew how to read it. This one wasn't subtle. The pressure valve had been replaced at some point in the last 2 years. The weld was newer than the surrounding metal, but it had been installed by someone who'd misread the spec. Not by much. Enough. He was 40 minutes into the diagnosis when the elevator doors opened, and a woman walked in like she owned the room, which, Nolan would later learn, she did. Her name was Helena Voss. She was 37 years old, the managing director of Nolan Voss's Western operations, and she had been in a meeting on the 11th floor when someone slid a note across the table telling her the repair contractor had arrived. She'd excused herself without finishing her sentence. That was the kind of person she was. She finished things, but she also knew when to move. She stopped a few feet away from where Nolan was crouched beside the boiler and looked at what he was doing with the focused attention of someone who didn't understand the mechanics but understood the problem. "How bad?" she asked. "Fixable," he said without looking up. "Give me 2 hours. We have a board meeting at 1. Then you'll have heat by 11. She stood there for a moment. Most people, when they came down here, either talked too much or left immediately. She did neither. She watched him work for another 30 seconds, and then she said, "What caused it?" "Bad install on the pressure valve. Whoever did it was working from the right spec but missed a tolerance by about 3 millimeters. Not a big error. Just enough to cause a slow failure over about 24 months. How do you know it's been 24 months? He pointed to the corrosion pattern on the coupling below the valve. The oxidation here and here. If it had failed faster, this section would look different. Helena looked at where he was pointing. She didn't pretend to see what he saw, but she also didn't dismiss it. "You've done this a long time, long enough." She nodded, as if that answered something, and took the elevator back upstairs. He had the boiler running by 10:40. He wrote up the report, listed the replaced components, noted the installation error clearly but without editorializing, and left it with Brett at the front desk, along with the invoice. He was back in his truck with the heat running by 11:15, and he was thinking about picking up Maisie from school and whether he had anything in the house for dinner that didn't require a grocery run when his phone rang. It was Brett. "Ms. Voss would like to speak with you before you leave the area. Are you still nearby?" He was parked 2 blocks away. He said yes. She met him in a small boardroom on the 3rd floor that had a view of the parking structure and a whiteboard still covered in someone else's meeting notes. She was carrying a coffee she'd clearly forgotten to drink, and she set it down and looked at him directly in a way that some people found uncomfortable, and Nolan found refreshing. "I've been dealing with this building's mechanical issues for 3 years," she said. "I've had 4 different contractors through here. You're the first one who explained what actually happened. That's in the report. I know, I read it on the way down." She paused. "We have 2 other properties with aging systems. I'd like to put you on a retainer. Monthly inspections, priority response, the works. Are you available?" Nolan looked at her. He thought about his schedule, which was full but not inflexible. He thought about Maisie's daycare bill, which was arriving next week. He thought about the leaking tap in his own apartment that he kept meaning to fix and hadn't because he spent so much of his time fixing other people's things. "I'm available," he said. The retainer arrangement started the 1st week of March. The 2 additional properties were a mixed-use building in St. James and a smaller commercial unit in the Exchange District, and, both of them, had the particular kind of deferred maintenance personality that happens when a building is managed by someone who understands spreadsheets better than infrastructure. Nolan went through both of them methodically, filed his reports, and waited. He didn't see Helena Voss for 3 weeks after the initial meeting. When she appeared again, it was at the Exchange District property on a Thursday afternoon, unannounced, while he was replacing a section of copper piping in the utility room on the 2nd floor. "You found something that wasn't on the inspection list," she said. She was looking at the section of old pipe he'd set aside, gray-green with mineral buildup, pinhole corrosion just starting at the joint. "It would have been on next month's list," he said. "I moved it up." "What does that cost me?" "Nothing extra. It was adjacent to what I was already doing. Replacing it now saves you a call at 2 in the morning in about 6 weeks. She looked at the pipe, then at him. "How do you know 6 weeks?" "The corrosion rate, the water hardness in this part of the city, the pressure readings from last month." He shrugged slightly. Pattern recognition. Helena set down the folder she was carrying. She always seemed to be carrying a folder, and leaned against the doorframe. "Where did you train?" "Red River College." "Then on the job, not an engineer, journeyman gas fitter and pipe trades. Red Seal certification. But you think like an engineer." He wasn't sure if that was a compliment or an observation, so he treated it like neither. "I think like someone who doesn't want to come back to the same problem twice." She almost smiled. "Not quite. Fair enough." She left, and he finished the pipe, and on the way home he stopped at the grocery store and bought chicken thighs because Maisie had decided she didn't like ground beef anymore, a position she'd announced with great firmness on Monday and would probably revise by the weekend. He'd been working for Aldrin Voss for 6 weeks when he noticed the discrepancy in the St. James property's maintenance log. He wasn't looking for it. He was checking the log against his own records from the previous month's inspection. A habit he'd developed years ago, because the most useful thing you could do before a site visit was understand what the site thought had already been done. The log said the fire suppression system had been tested and certified in January. His records from the March inspection said the certification sticker on the panel was dated November, not January. It was possible someone had made a clerical error. It was also possible that the January certification had been logged but not performed, which was a different kind of problem. He documented it in his inspection notes the way he documented everything. Factually, without inference, with the relevant dates listed side by side, he flagged it to Brett. Brett said he'd look into it. 3 days later, Nolan was back at the St. James property for an unrelated issue, a rooftop unit that had started making a sound that no rooftop unit should make. When he saw a man he didn't recognize leaving the utility room on the ground floor. The man was wearing a contractor badge, which was normal. What was less normal was the way he looked at Nolan. Too long, too deliberate, the kind of look that's trying to calculate something. Nolan noted the badge number out of habit. He didn't mention it to anyone. The rooftop unit turned out to have a failing bearing, which he replaced. On his way out, he stopped at the building's security desk and asked casually if the utility room had been accessed that morning by a certified contractor for any scheduled work. The guard checked the log. It hadn't. The thing about Helena Voss that Nolan had begun to understand over 6 weeks of peripheral observation was that she was someone who had built something real. Aldrin Voss was technically a partnership. Her name was the second name, but the infrastructure side of the business, the physical asset management, the buildings, the long-term capital plans, that was hers. She'd grown it from 2 properties to 14 in less than a decade. She worked the hours that kind of growth required, and she didn't seem to resent them, which was either admirable or a warning sign, depending on how you looked at it. She also, Nolan had noticed, trusted her people perhaps a degree more than she should. Not naively, she asked hard questions, she read documents carefully, she pushed back when something didn't add up. But she trusted the system she'd built to surface problems before they became crises. And systems, in Nolan's experience, only surfaced what they were designed to look for. He asked Brett, with careful casualness, who managed the maintenance contracts for the St. James property before he'd been brought on. Brett looked slightly uncomfortable. That would have been through Grant Selby's office. He handles the vendor relationships on the property side. Grant Selby, Otto A. Ems, Voss's business development director. He's been with the firm about 4 years. Nolan thanked him and went back to his truck and sat there for a moment with the engine running, thinking about the maintenance log, the certification sticker, the man with the deliberate look, and the 4 years Grant Selby had been managing vendor relationships for a portfolio of properties whose systems were in universally poor condition. He thought about Carla, who had died of a cardiac event that had been preceded by 18 months of symptoms her doctor had documented carefully and done nothing about. Nolan had spent a year afterwards studying those records, trying to understand not what had gone wrong in the biology. He'd understood that well enough, but what had gone wrong in the system? The answer, in the end, was simple. The person responsible for seeing the whole picture had a professional incentive not to see it clearly. He started the truck and drove to pick up Maisie. Maisie had her mother's persistence and her father's quiet, which was a combination that produced a child who would sit with a problem until she solved it and then say nothing about it until she was ready. She was working on a library book about volcanoes when he got home, sitting cross-legged on the kitchen floor with her socks on and her boots in the middle of the entryway, where she'd stepped out of them and simply continued moving. "Dad," she said without looking up, "did you know that lava is just really angry rock?" "I did not know that," Nolan said. "It's in the book." She turned a page. "Can we have pasta tonight? I have chicken." "Can you make the chicken like pasta?" He wasn't sure what that meant, but he said he'd try, and she accepted this without further discussion because she trusted him. That was the arrangement. She trusted him. He didn't let things fall through the cracks. He made the chicken into a kind of improvised cacciatore with canned tomatoes and pasta because he'd apparently raised a child with a sophisticated palate and a very short grocery list. And while it was on the stove, he sat at the kitchen table and wrote down, in point form, Everything he'd observed about the St. James property and the maintenance log, and Grant Selby's 4-year tenure managing vendors, whose work had consistently fallen below standard. He wasn't an investigator. He wasn't going to walk into Helena Voss's office with a dossier, but he was a person who noticed things, and he had a professional obligation to document accurately, and the documentation was starting to tell a story that didn't require any inference at all. He went back to the St. James building 2 days later for what he described to Brett as a follow-up on the rooftop unit. He also spent 40 minutes in the utility room with a flashlight and his own inspection records, and he found what he was looking for in the third thing he checked. The sprinkler test valve had been manually reset after the testing date, logged in January. The mechanism showed use. The log said the system had been tested by a certified contractor, but the wear pattern on the valve and the adjacent fittings was consistent with a reset, not a full test cycle. Someone had logged a test that hadn't happened. He photographed everything with his phone, referenced the photos in his inspection report, and filed it through the standard channel to Brett. Then he called Brett directly and told him he thought the fire suppression document chain warranted a third-party review before anyone acted on it administratively. Why third-party? Brett asked. Because if the documentation is incorrect, the review should come from someone who wasn't party to the original record-keeping. There was a pause on Brett's end that lasted long enough to mean something. I'll pass it up. 2 hours later, Helena Voss called him. I just read your inspection report, she said. The full one. Okay. You're describing documentation that was filed through my vendor approval process, which Grant Selby administers. I'm describing what I observed in the building, Nolan said. The documentation is your interpretation. A pause. Then, can you be here at 4? He rearranged 2 things on his afternoon schedule, called his neighbor Mrs. Latchance about collecting Maisie from school. She did this sometimes, in the way that neighbors in older Winnipeg apartment buildings still did, as a form of informal mutual aid, and drove back downtown. Grant Selby's name was on an office door on the 7th floor. Nolan had never met the man. When he arrived at 4, Helena was already in a small meeting room at the end of the hall, and she had a man with her who Nolan had not expected. Someone from the city's fire inspection office, who had apparently been contacted by Helena's legal team within the past 90 minutes. Helena looked at Nolan when he walked in, and what he saw on her face was the controlled expression of someone who had spent a long time building something and had just received credible evidence that a part of it had been compromised. Walk us through what you found, she said. He did. He started with the maintenance log discrepancy, then the certification sticker, then the unknown contractor, then the valve wear. He was careful and specific. He didn't speculate. He described only what he had observed and documented. The man from the fire inspection office asked 2 questions. Nolan answered both. Then the room was quiet. How long has this been going on? Helena asked. She wasn't asking Nolan. She was thinking out loud. The oldest discrepancy I can identify from the documentation trail is about 14 months, Nolan said, because he'd been thinking about it and he'd looked at the records. But my access only goes back to when I was brought on. Before that was Grant Selby's department, she said. Nolan said nothing. He'd said what he had to say. Grant Selby was asked to surrender his building access credentials that same afternoon. The fire inspection office opened a formal review of all 3 Aldrin Voss properties the following morning. The review would eventually determine that Selby had been billing for contractor services that were performed only partially or not at all, and filing documentation that satisfied internal audit requirements without triggering external oversight. Over 14 months, the losses totaled enough that the number made Helena's legal team go quiet for a moment when they read it. Nolan found out about the total indirectly, weeks later, through Brett, who had the specific kind of compulsive honesty that makes someone say a number out loud even when they've been asked not to. The morning after the meeting with the fire inspector, Nolan picked up Maisie from school, because it was Tuesday, and on Tuesdays he always picked her up. She came through the school doors in her yellow coat, the one she'd chosen herself at the thrift store because it had a fox embroidered on the pocket, and she held her backpack straps with both hands the way she always did, like the bag might try to escape. "Good day?" he asked. "We did fractions," she said. "They're not as bad as everyone says." "Fractions are fine," he agreed. Jalen cried, "At the fractions?" "At the fractions." She considered this with the seriousness it deserved. "He'll be okay." He took her hand and they walked to the truck, and the cold came off the parking lot in waves, and the sky was doing what February skies in Winnipeg do, which is nothing at all, just an even gray that goes all the way to the horizon and asks nothing of you. "Dad," Maisie said, when they were in the truck with the heater running, "is everything okay?" He looked at her. "Yes," he said. "Why? You have your thinking face." He didn't know he had a thinking face. "I had a complicated day. Did you fix it?" He pulled out of the parking lot and thought about it. The boiler in February, the pipe at the Exchange District property, the valve in the utility room. The documentation that told its story only if you were willing to read it all the way through. "Yeah," he said. "I think so." She seemed satisfied with this. She opened her backpack and pulled out her volcano book, which she'd apparently taken to school for personal enrichment, and she read quietly the rest of the way home. Helena Voss came to the St. James building one more time in the last week of March, while the formal review was still ongoing and the building was operating under interim certification. She found Nolan in the utility room. He was there most mornings that week, having made himself accessible on the grounds that the review team had questions. And he had the clearest documentation, and she stood in the doorway the way she had that first day in the basement on Portage. "I want to offer you something," she said. "You're already paying the retainer." More than the retainer. She looked at the room, the tidy organization of tools, the labeled components he'd set aside for the inspector, the binder of his own records sitting open on the work surface. "I'd like you to manage the mechanical systems across all 14 properties, full contract, annual rate. You'd bring in whatever staff you need." Nolan set down the fitting he was holding. "That's a significant scope," he said. "I know. You'd also have authority to flag anything you believe requires external review without going through the vendor approval process first. Direct to me." He looked at her. "Because the vendor approval process is how this happened." "Partly," she said, "and partly because I should have had someone with direct oversight a long time ago. Someone I could trust." She paused, and he recognized the weight of that word in her voice. The way a person says trust when they've just spent several weeks learning what it looks like when it's broken. You didn't have to document all of it. You could have flagged one thing and let someone else take it from there. "That's not how I work." "I know," she said. "That's why I'm asking you." He thought about what it meant to say yes. The scope of work, the admin overhead, the staffing, the fact that he'd spent 6 years building something small because small things could be managed alone. And this was not small. He thought about the 15-story building on Portage, heating again by 11 in the morning. He thought about Maisie and the daycare bill, and the leaking tap in his apartment that he kept moving to the bottom of the list. He thought about the systems that fail, not because of any single catastrophic error, but because no one was reading the whole picture at once. The slow failures, the tolerances missed by 3 millimeters, the tests that were logged and never performed. He thought about the fact that he was good at this. Not just competent, genuinely good. And that he'd spent several years behaving as though being good at a thing was a private matter, something to keep modest and contained, because the world had repeatedly demonstrated that it was not particularly interested in being reminded. "I'll need to revise the rate," he said. "Send me a number, and I'd want a clause allowing me to reject any vendor whose documentation I can't verify independently. Done. And I keep the retainer structure even when I bring on staff. Aberhart Mechanical stays the contracting entity." She looked at him steadily. "Is there anything else?" "I'll need a parking pass for the Portage building," he said. "The parkade rate is unreasonable." Something shifted in her expression, not quite a smile, but adjacent to one, in the way that competent people sometimes register genuine amusement at genuine specificity. "I'll have Brett arrange it." He signed the contract on a Thursday afternoon, at a table in the third-floor boardroom, with the view of the parking structure. He took a photo of it on his phone, not because he was sentimental, but because Maisie had asked him to, having been told there was a big work thing happening, and having opinions about documentation. He sent her the photo. She sent back a fox emoji and then immediately a volcano emoji, which he was fairly certain was a non sequitur but appreciated anyway. On the drive home, the city moved through the windows the way Winnipeg does in late March, still cold, but with something different in the light, a quality that's hard to name, but that everyone who has lived through a prairie winter knows by feel. The sense that the worst of it has passed, that the thing you were enduring is almost done enduring you. He picked up Maisie from Mrs. Lachance's apartment, and they walked the 2 floors up to their own, and she told him about her day with the unhurried thoroughness of a child who has a lot to say and trusts that she won't be interrupted. He listened. The hallway was warm. The light through the window at the end of the corridor was doing that late March thing, going sideways and gold, and it reached all the way across the linoleum to where they were walking, and Maisie walked through it without noticing, the way children walk through good things, easily, without stopping, already on to the next.